My name is Timothy Gibson, and I was 32 when this happened. It was early May 2019, and I had just finished a grueling 6-month contract as a travel nurse in Baltimore. The job had been brutal, long shifts, heartbreaking cases, and one patient I couldn't save no matter how hard I tried. His face still lingered in my mind, and I needed space to breathe. That's why I bought the RV. I had no plan except to drive, park somewhere beautiful, and let the quiet heal me. That's how I ended up at Seneca Creek near Smokehole Canyon, West Virginia. The locals called it Devil's Gorge, but I didn't care about the name. I cared about the view. The pull-off was perfect, isolated and perched right on the edge of the gorge. The air was cool and smelled of pine, and the canyon spread out below me in jagged cliffs and swirling mist. I parked my RV, stepped out, and just stood there, letting the silence soak into my bones. I felt a glimmer of peace for the first time in months. My plan was simple: hike, take some photos, and not think about anything for a while. I grabbed my camera and followed a faint trail along the edge of the gorge. The path wound through dense trees, their branches forming a canopy so thick it felt like dusk, even though it was mid-afternoon. That's when I found it. The stone altar was tucked into a hollow, half hidden by vines and moss. It looked ancient, weathered and wrong. There was something unnatural about its placement, like it didn't belong here. Carved into its surface was the word malum, Latin for evil, I said aloud. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, but I couldn't stop myself from snapping a photo. It was eerie and beautiful in its own way, and I knew it would make a great addition to my collection. I was just turning to leave when I heard it, a whisper, faint and raspy like dry leaves brushing together. Leave. I froze, staring into the trees, but there was no one there. My pulse quickened as I backed away from the altar, stumbling a little on the uneven ground. I told myself it was just the wind. It had to be the wind. That night, the wind came back. I was editing photos in the RV when I heard it, a soft scratching sound, like claws against metal. My stomach clenched as I turned off the lights and peered through the window. The moon cast long shadows across the ground, but there was nothing there. I stepped outside, armed with my flashlight, and saw the marks, claw-like scratches raked down the side of the RV. A surge of adrenaline shot through me as I swung the flashlight toward the trees, half expecting to see an animal, a bear maybe, but the forest was still. Too still. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just silence. My breath fogged in the cold air, and I realized I was trembling. Probably just a raccoon, I muttered, but I didn't believe it. The next morning, I told myself I was overreacting. The scratches were weird, sure, but it was the middle of the woods. Animals did strange things. I packed a lunch and decided to hike deeper into the canyon. Maybe I'd find a new trail, something to distract me. The gorge was stunning, its cliffs rising like jagged teeth on either side. The air felt heavy, as if the canyon was holding its breath, but I pushed forward. That's when I started noticing them. Symbols. They were carved into the trees and scratched into the dirt, strange and unfamiliar. At first I thought they were just graffiti, but they didn't look like anything I'd seen before. They made my skin crawl. The trail led me to a dead end, a sheer drop into the gorge below. As I turned to head back, I heard it again. The whisper. It came from the trees, faint and raspy. Anthony. I froze. My name. It had whispered my name. I practically ran back to the RV, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got inside, I locked the doors and pulled down the blinds, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the fear wouldn't leave me. It sat heavy in my stomach, coiling tighter with every hour that passed. That night, I woke to something worse. It started with the whispers, soft and insistent, coming from all directions. Then came the knocking. Tap, tap, tap on the windows, on the door, on the walls. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out the window, but the light only seemed to make the shadows move. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the firelight, gaunt and impossibly tall, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Her face was a patchwork of cracked skin, like porcelain shattered and glued back together. Her eyes, black, empty voids, locked onto mine. The whisper turned into a scream, piercing and relentless, and I stumbled back, clutching my ears. When I looked again, she was gone. The next day I tried to leave. I packed everything as fast as I could, desperate to put miles between me and the gorge. But the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died no matter how many times I turned the key. I grabbed my pack and started walking, following the road back to the main highway. But every time I thought I was making progress, the path looped back to the gorge. It was impossible, like the forest was twisting itself around me. By the time the sun began to set, I was back at the RV, exhausted and terrified. The final night was the worst. I built a fire, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. It didn't. The whispers started again, louder this time, and the witch appeared just beyond the light. She didn't lunge or attack. She just watched, her cracked face stretching into a horrible grin. And then she spoke. "You let him die, didn't you?" Her voice was a knife, cutting into the guilt I'd tried so hard to bury. "You could have saved him." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "It wasn't my fault. You failed him." I screamed, grabbing the camera and flipping through my photos, desperate for answers. That's when I saw the altar. The carvings were clear now, showing a ritual, a way to banish her. It required a sacrifice. I grabbed my medical kit, my hands trembling as I pulled out a scalpel. The witch was closer now, her shadow looming over the fire. I took a deep breath, pressed the blade to my palm, and dragged it across the skin. Blood pooled in my hand, warm and sticky, and I smeared it onto the photo of the altar. The air seemed to shatter. The witch screamed, her voice high and shrill, and the fire roared to life. Her form twisted and buckled, pulled toward the gorge as if by invisible chains. I pressed my bleeding hand to the ground, whispering the Latin words I'd seen carved into the stone, Malum habeas, evil, be gone. The witch collapsed into the earth, her body dissolving into ash. And then, just like that, the forest was still. When the sun rose, the RV started without a problem. I drove until I hit the highway, not daring to look back. The photos I took in the gorge were corrupted, every one of them except for one. It showed the witch standing in the shadows, watching me. I deleted it. I haven't camped alone since. My name is Jason Ellis and I'm 45 years old. It happened in late October last year during a trip to Dogtown Commons, an abandoned settlement in Gloucester, Massachusetts. I went there to document its history for a book I was working on about New England's forgotten towns. I thought it would be just another quiet excursion in my RV, a chance to escape the noise of city life and dive into research. I was wrong. Dogtown was the kind of place that clung to the edges of memory and myth. Once a bustling colonial village, it was now a network of overgrown trails, crumbling stone walls and strange, moss-covered boulders. Local legends claimed it was cursed, haunted by the witch Thomasine Younger, who had cursed the land before her death. But I didn't believe in curses or witches. I believed in facts, and I planned to find them. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the treetops. The sky was heavy with clouds, the light dimming quickly. My RV bumped along the narrow dirt road until I found a clearing big enough to park. The air was damp and cold, and the surrounding woods were eerily quiet. After setting up camp, I grabbed my notepad, a flashlight, and my digital recorder, ready to explore the ruins before dark. But as soon as I turned on the recorder, it sputtered and died. I frowned and checked the batteries. They were brand new. Shrugging it off as a fluke, I grabbed my backup recorder, but it wouldn't power on either. A chill crept up my spine. Maybe it was just the damp air affecting the electronics. At least that's what I told myself. I started down one of the main trails, marked by weathered stones barely visible through the moss and dirt. The forest seemed alive, the trees pressing in around me, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The silence was unnerving. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt path. Dogtown was famous for its boulders, massive stones engraved with moralistic sayings. As I approached one, the faint outline of carved words caught my attention. Courage. I reached out to brush away the moss when I heard it, the faintest whisper, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. I froze, my hand hovering over the stone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No response. I told myself it was the wind and moved on, though my heartbeat quickened with each step. As I ventured deeper, I noticed something strange. A boulder I passed had carvings that didn't match anything I'd seen in my research. The words weren't in English, and they seemed freshly etched, as if someone had been there recently. The characters were sharp and jagged, almost angry looking. By the time I returned to the RV, the sky had turned a slate grey and a thick mist was rolling in. The air felt heavier, the kind of weight that makes it hard to breathe. I set up a small campfire, hoping the light and warmth would steady my nerves. As night fell, the noises began. First, it was faint laughter drifting through the trees like a memory. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the woods. The beam cut through the fog, revealing nothing but gnarled branches and shifting shadows. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just animals. But then I saw her. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure, a woman cloaked in shadows. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She just stood there watching. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step closer, the flashlight trembling in my hand. But when I blinked, she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The laughter and footsteps continued, growing louder and more insistent as the hours crawled by. When dawn finally came, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I wasn't sure I could handle another night like that. Determined to make sense of what was happening, I spent the morning poring over my notes. That's when I found it, a passage about offerings made to Thomasine Younger. The villagers, desperate to appease her spirit, would leave pouches of salt and coins near her home, accompanied by whispered apologies. It sounded ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was the key to ending whatever was happening. I gathered what I needed, a handful of coins from my pocket and some salt from my kitchen supplies, and made my way back into the woods. The mist had thickened, clinging to the ground like a living thing. The paths seemed to shift under my feet, leading me in circles. Finally, I found it, the stone foundation of what must have been Thomasine's house. Kneeling in the dirt, I placed the pouch near the ruins and whispered, "I'm sorry. I mean no harm. Please let me leave." For a moment, everything was still. The mist seemed to lift slightly and the oppressive weight in the air eased. I let out a shaky breath and stood, ready to head back to the RV. But as I walked, the paths shifted again. The landmarks I'd memorized were gone, replaced by new, unfamiliar terrain. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. Then came the whispers, louder this time, surrounding me. My name echoed through the trees, spoken by voices that didn't belong to anyone I knew. "Stay," a voice said, clear and cold. "You belong here." I turned, and there she was again, the cloaked woman standing just a few feet away. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and empty. She raised a hand, pointing at me, and I felt a coldness wash over me, seeping into my bones. I ran. When I reached the RV, I didn't stop to look back. I threw open the door, started the engine, and slammed the accelerator. The RV lurched forward, the tires skidding on the damp ground as I sped down the dirt road. The mist followed, twisting and curling like smoke. In the rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the middle of the road, her figure growing smaller as I put distance between us. But her eyes, they burned into me, as if they were still watching. I made it home safely, but Dogtown never left me. Weeks later, I began hearing whispers outside my apartment. Carvings started appearing in the stones near my building, messages eerily similar to the ones I'd seen in Dogtown. I stopped working on the book, unable to relive the experience. Some histories, I've come to realize, are not meant to be uncovered. Some curses can't be escaped, and some places will never let you go. My name is Edward Fletcher. I'm 34 years old, and I'd like to think I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. Being a travel nurse, I've seen my fair share of life's chaos, things that would send most people running. But what happened to me last fall at Swift River Reservation changed the way I think about fear, about loss, and about the things we leave behind. It began as a solo RV camping trip, a way to escape and reflect. I've been doing a lot of these trips since my sister Emily died 2 years ago. Driving through the countryside, setting up camp in the middle of nowhere, it gave me peace, or at least a reprieve from the constant ache in my chest. I'd read about Swift River online. The reservoir, created in the 1930s by flooding 4 towns, fascinated me. Entire villages, they said, were still submerged beneath the water. Houses, schools, even cemeteries, all buried. There was something poetic and haunting about it. I told myself it was just another quiet place to park my RV and breathe. But from the moment I arrived, something felt off. I pulled into the campground late in the afternoon. The lot was empty, which didn't surprise me. Most people probably preferred more popular spots. But as I stepped out of my RV and looked around, the silence struck me. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint lap of water against the shore. It was eerie, but I shook it off. Solitude was what I wanted, after all. My RV gave me trouble almost immediately. The battery, which had worked fine during the drive, refused to charge. I had no power for the lights or my phone. Normally, I'd call for roadside assistance, but there was no signal out here. I wasn't too worried. I had a flashlight and plenty of supplies. I could manage for a couple of nights. The first night was uneventful. Mostly I sat by the water, journaling and letting my mind wander. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a fog began rolling in, thick and unnatural. It spread across the reservoir like a living thing, curling around the trees and creeping toward my campsite. That's when I heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. The sound came again, unmistakable, the laughter of children, distant but clear. "Hello?" I called, shining my flashlight toward the woods. Nothing moved. The beam only illuminated the fog, dense and impenetrable. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe an echo from another campsite, though I knew I was alone. Shaking my head, I returned to the RV and locked the door. The next morning, I found my hiking boots at the base of a tree, neatly placed side by side. I frowned, trying to remember if I'd left them outside. I was sure I hadn't. As I picked them up, a chill ran down my spine. Shaking it off, I set out on a trail that wound through the woods and led to a small abandoned cemetery, a remnant of one of the flooded towns. The headstones, moss-covered and leaning, were scattered among the trees. Standing there, I felt a strange heaviness, as if the air itself were pressing down on me. I started taking pictures, trying to capture the eerie beauty of the place. It wasn't until I returned to the RV and reviewed the photos that I saw it. In one of the shots, a shadowy figure stood between the trees. It was small, child-sized, and blurry, but unmistakably there. That night, the children came back. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the laughter again. It was louder this time, closer. Then came the sound of small feet running on the roof of the RV. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. Grabbing my flashlight, I opened the door and stepped outside. The fog was back, thicker than before. The laughter echoed all around me, disorienting and impossible to pinpoint. "Who's out there?" I shouted. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the fog. That's when I saw the handprints. They were smeared across the RV's windows, muddy and child-sized. I stumbled back inside and locked the door. For the first time, I felt a deep, bone-chilling fear. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed up my gear, ready to drive out, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died no matter how many times I turned the key. Frustrated and scared, I grabbed my journal and began writing everything down. It helped me process what was happening, even as the unease grew. That evening, I walked to the water's edge, hoping the calm of the reservoir would soothe my nerves. But the ripples were back, moving in slow, deliberate patterns, as if something beneath the surface was stirring. Then I saw them. Children. Dozens of them, standing in the shallows. Their faces were pale, their eyes dark. They stared at me, unmoving, their reflections rippling in the water. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. They didn't speak. Instead, they turned and pointed toward the woods. I don't know what compelled me to follow them. Maybe it was the way they looked at me, not with malice, but with sadness. Or maybe it was the nagging feeling that I owed them something. The children led me to an overgrown trail where the trees seemed to close in around me. The air grew colder with every step until I found myself standing in a clearing. There, I saw it, a broken road, cracked and covered in moss. I realized it was the remains of a main street, one of the lost towns buried beneath the reservoir. The children surrounded me now, their whispers filling the air. They showed me flashes of their lives, playing in fields, walking to school, sitting at dinner tables. Then the images shifted. Homes were flooded, graves were disturbed, and families were torn apart. I saw parents crying, children screaming, and water swallowing everything they knew. "Remember us," they whispered, their voices overlapping. I dropped to my knees, overwhelmed by their grief. It was as if the weight of their lost lives had been poured into me, threatening to drown me. When I woke, the sun was rising. I was lying by the reservoir shore, soaked to the skin but alive. My journal was open beside me, its pages filled with words I didn't write. Names. Dozens of names. I left Swift River that morning, my RV miraculously starting without a hitch. But I wasn't the same. The names I found in my journal matched those of children buried in the towns that now lay beneath the water. I spent weeks researching them, piecing together their stories and sharing them wherever I could. I don't know if it's enough, but it's all I can do. And sometimes, late at night, I hear their laughter again, soft, distant, and maybe a little less sad. The road into the Adirondacks was long, winding, and empty, just how I liked it. After a few hours of driving, I pulled the RV off the narrow trail and into a small clearing by the lake. The pines stretched high and thick around me, their dark green needles blending into the overcast sky. This was exactly what I needed, complete isolation. No people, no noise, just the quiet of the forest and the sound of my own thoughts. I parked the RV, turned off the engine, and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp, with the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant ripple of water. Perfect. This place would give me the quiet I craved, a chance to think without the distractions of civilian life. Ever since leaving the military, I'd been chasing peace, and this felt like it could be the spot where I'd finally find it. I grabbed my gear and went about setting up camp. It didn't take long. I'd done this enough times to know the routine. Gather firewood, get a small fire going, and make sure the RV was ready for a night out in the wilderness. As I made my way through the trees, something caught my eye. On one of the nearby trunks, there was a strange marking, a crude carving of a figure, long and thin, etched into the bark. I frowned, running my fingers over it. Just a kid's prank, I figured, probably a bored hiker from weeks ago. But as I moved through the forest gathering wood, I found more of them. Carved figures on the trees, all tall and slender, stretching higher than any human could reach. It was strange, but I wasn't here to think about strange things. I was here to forget. By the time the sun set, the fire was crackling softly, casting flickering light across the clearing. I settled in next to the warmth, staring out at the darkening forest. There was a peace in the solitude, something comforting about being alone with the sounds of the wilderness. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something. The forest was too quiet. No rustling leaves, no night animals scurrying about, just silence. And then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. I shook my head. "You're just on edge," I muttered to myself, trying to dismiss the tension building in my chest. The wilderness could play tricks on you if you let it. I knew that better than most. I was here to clear my head, not to let it run wild. But then I saw it. At the edge of my vision, just for a split second, something moved, tall, thin, just beyond the trees. I jumped to my feet, gripping the flashlight tighter, and aimed the beam toward where I'd seen the figure. but there was nothing. Only the dark outline of the pines swaying slightly in the wind. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, every muscle tense, waiting for something to step out of the shadows. But after a long moment, the rustling stopped, the trees swayed, and the forest fell back into its unsettling quiet. I forced myself to sit back down, staring into the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The next morning, I woke early, determined to shake off the nerves from the night before. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike deeper into the woods. Maybe if I put some distance between myself and the campsite, I could clear my head. The trail was faint, barely more than a thin path winding through the trees. As I walked, I found more of the carvings on the trees, each one stranger than the last. They were everywhere, slender, elongated figures with no faces, all staring outward, all watching. The forest felt darker here, the canopy thick enough that the sunlight barely broke through. About an hour in, I reached a ridge overlooking the valley. The view was stunning. Endless trees stretching out below, the mountains rising in the distance. I was about to pull out my camera when I heard footsteps behind me. "Morning," a voice said. I turned to see an older man, probably in his 60s, standing a few feet away. He was holding a bundle of firewood in his arms, his face weathered and sun-creased like someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, giving him a nod. "Not many people come this deep into the forest," the man replied, his voice low and rough. He looked me up and down, then glanced toward the valley. "You camping nearby?" "Yeah, just over by the lake, trying to get some quiet." He gave me a long look, his expression unreadable. "You should be careful. This part of the Adirondacks, it's different." "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He glanced around, his eyes flicking nervously toward the trees. "There's something in these woods. People call it the Watcher. It stays deep in the forest, watching from the shadows. You see it once, and you'll start seeing it everywhere." I laughed, shaking my head. Local ghost stories. The man didn't smile. "It's not a story. It's real. People who see the Watcher, they don't come back the same." He took a step closer. "I'm telling you this because you look like you've seen things. You know when something's not right and something's not right here." I met his gaze, feeling that familiar knot of unease tightening in my gut. "What do you mean?" "You'll know when it's close. You'll hear it first and then you'll feel it." He turned, starting back down the trail. "Just don't stay too long." I watched him go, his words echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as superstition, but the way he'd looked at me, like he'd seen the same thing I had last night, made it hard to dismiss. That evening, back at camp, the unease was worse. The forest felt like it was closing in, the trees towering higher than I remembered, the shadows deeper, darker. The wind had picked up, making the fire flicker and sputter, but it didn't drown out the sounds. The rustling came back, louder this time, and with it something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the darkness, but the beam barely seemed to penetrate the trees. The footsteps stopped as soon as the light hit them, but when I moved the beam, they started again. I stood, turning in a slow circle, the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. My pulse was pounding, adrenaline kicking in. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone out here. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. And then, just beyond the firelight, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing between the trees. Its body was almost skeletal, its limbs too long, its head bent slightly as if it were watching me from above. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were hollow, dark pits that stared right at me. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking despite myself. The figure didn't respond. It stayed still, silent, its form almost blending into the shadows. I raised my knife, backing toward the RV. The figure remained at the edge of the light, watching, waiting. I reached the door, yanked it open, and stumbled inside. slamming it shut behind me. For hours I sat by the window, knife in hand, waiting for the figure to move, but it never did. It just stood there, barely visible in the darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on the RV. At dawn, the figure was gone, but the carvings had multiplied, dozens of them surrounding the campsite. The same tall, thin figures etched into the trees like a silent army. I didn't waste time. I packed up everything, threw it into the RV, and started the engine. As I drove away, the carvings seemed to watch me, following me down the narrow trail, their hollow eyes staring. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the Ada, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as the trees thinned and the road stretched out in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Watcher was still out there, somewhere in those woods. It was still watching, and maybe it always would be. I've always liked the quiet of the road. No one asking questions, no one poking into your business, just miles of highway, the hum of the engine, and the occasional crackle of a distant voice on the CB. But that night, somewhere on Route 50 in the middle of Nevada, the silence felt different. Too quiet, too heavy. It had been days since I'd had a decent break. I'd left San Francisco with a load of building materials, bound for Kansas City, figuring Route 50 would cut the travel time. They call it the loneliest road in America, and I've driven it enough times to know why. For hours at a time, you don't see a soul, just endless desert dotted with mountains that never seem to get any closer. I was more tired than I wanted to admit, the kind of tired that sneaks up on you, where your eyelids grow heavy and the lines on the road start to blur. Normally I'd push through, but something told me to pull over this time. I glanced at the clock and decided to hit the next rest stop I saw. A quick nap, I told myself, and I'd be good as new. I felt a wave of relief when I spotted the weathered sign for a rest stop 2 miles ahead. The stop wasn't marked on my map, which was odd, but these old highways have plenty of places that don't show up anymore. The place looked like it hadn't seen a decent coat of paint in a decade. The lights above the parking area flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. A beat-up picnic table and a few rusted trash bins were all that marked the stop. The restroom building sat off to the side, its windows dark, and the air around it felt heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I pulled the rig into the lot and killed the engine. Silence settled in around me, pressing through the windows. I leaned back in the driver's seat, rubbing my face. I just needed a few hours of sleep and I'd be good to go. But before I could settle in, nature called. Typical. With a sigh, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab. The night air was cold, much colder than I'd expected for Nevada, and the wind carried a strange scent, dry, with an underlying hint of something rotten. I wrinkled my nose but kept moving toward the restroom. The building was worse up close. Graffiti covered the exterior, but it wasn't the usual stuff. No names or crude drawings. These were symbols, spirals, triangles, strange geometric shapes I couldn't quite place. Some of them were carved deep into the wood, like they'd been there a long time. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me harder inside, stronger than before. I flicked the light on, but the bulb overhead just buzzed and flickered weakly. I turned on my flashlight and swept it across the room. The place was empty, as I expected, but the walls were covered in more of those symbols, dozens of them, carved into the tiles, drawn on the mirrors. I did my business quickly, trying to ignore the feeling that those symbols were watching me, and made my way back out to the parking lot. That's when I saw the first figure. It was standing just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. A man in a heavy coat, his back to me, staring out into the desert. For a second, I considered calling out to him, but something about the way he stood there, so still, so quiet, made my gut twist. I stopped in my tracks, trying to decide if I should just get back in the truck and go. But the man didn't move. He didn't even seem to notice I was there. Maybe he was just another trucker, but I hadn't seen another rig on the road in hours. I took a step back toward my truck, keeping an eye on the figure. When I reached for the door handle, my fingers brushed something cold, too cold. I pulled my hand back, confused, and shone the flashlight on the handle. Symbols. Those same spirals and triangles scratched into the metal of my door. My heart started racing. I hadn't seen them there before. I would have noticed. I swallowed hard, scanning the lot, but the figure was gone, just vanished. I fumbled with the door, pulling it open and climbing back into the cab as fast as I could. I locked the doors and sat there, trying to steady my breathing, trying to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I'd driven across the country dozens of times, stopped in every kind of rundown, creepy rest stop imaginable, but nothing like this. The radio crackled to life suddenly, nearly making me jump out of my skin. For a second I thought it was just picking up static, but then a voice broke through, low, distorted. Frank. My heart skipped a beat. I snatched the CB mic. Who is this? Silence. I stared at the radio, waiting, but the voice didn't come back. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the sound of my name, it was too clear. I glanced out the window again, half expecting to see the man in the coat, but the lot was empty. The only movement was the weak flicker of the overhead lights. Still, that rotten smell lingered, hanging in the air like a warning. I was about to start the engine and get the hell out of there when I noticed something in the rearview mirror. There was another figure now, standing near the restrooms. This one was closer. I couldn't make out their face in the dim light, but they were staring right at me, not moving, not blinking, just watching. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but when I reached for the ignition, the engine sputtered and died before it could even turn over. I tried again, nothing. The lights on the dashboard flickered weakly before going out altogether. Come on, I muttered, trying to stay calm. Don't do this to me now. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal, no bars, no nothing. The figure was still there, closer now. Another figure appeared near the picnic table, and then another by the trash bins. They didn't approach, but they were closing in, little by little. My mouth was dry. I fumbled for the flashlight and shone it toward the restroom, hoping to get a better look at the figures. The beam of light cut through the dark, but when it hit the first figure, they were gone, just gone. I swept the light across the lot, but all the figures had disappeared, every single one. I didn't waste any more time. If my truck wasn't going to start, I'd fix it in the morning. For now, I just needed to get out. Out of here, on foot if I had to. I grabbed the toolbox from under the seat just in case and jumped down from the cab. That's when I noticed something else on the side of my truck. Etched into the paint was one of those symbols. Fresh. I could smell the metallic tang of scratched metal. It was the same spirals and triangles I'd seen in the bathroom, the same ones that had been on the door handle. The smell hit me again, stronger now. I turned, shining the flashlight toward the restroom, and that's when I saw it. The symbols were glowing. A faint, sickly light pulsed from the walls of the building. The carvings and scratches now alive with some kind of energy. The ground beneath my feet vibrated, a low hum building in my chest. I stumbled back toward the truck, my flashlight shaking in my grip, but the lights in the building grew brighter, casting long, flickering shadows across the lot. And then I heard the voice again. Frank. I whipped around, scanning the empty lot, but there was no one there. No figures, no man in the coat, just the voice, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Frank, you need to stay. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I kept moving, trying to get back into the cab. But the symbols, they were on my truck now, glowing with the same eerie light. The handle felt like ice under my fingers. The wind picked up, howling across the lot, carrying whispers with it. Low, urgent voices layered on top of each other, impossible to understand, but they felt old, ancient. I was frozen in place, trapped between the truck and whatever the hell was happening in that restroom. The lights, the symbols, the voices, I didn't know what to make of any of it, but I knew one thing, I had to leave now. The truck groaned as I climbed back into the cab, and I turned the key one last time, praying it would start. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. Without another thought, I slammed the truck into gear and floored it out of the lot, the tires skidding on the cracked asphalt. The rest stop disappeared in the rearview mirror, the glowing lights and symbols fading into the distance. As I drove down the highway, my hands trembling on the wheel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. The silence of the road was back, but it wasn't the same. The weight of those symbols, the voice, it lingered, and I knew deep down that whatever was tied to that rest stop wasn't finished with me. I don't stop on Route 50 anymore, not after that night. Some places are better left in the past. I had been driving for hours, the Mojave Desert stretching endlessly around me, barren and vast under the relentless sun. The road was long behind me now, just an empty trail of dust leading out to nowhere. Perfect. This was exactly what I needed, a break from work, from the grind, from people. Out here there was nothing but silence and space. No cell towers, no deadlines, no distractions. Just me and the desert. I pulled the RV to a stop near a rocky outcrop and stepped out. The air was dry and still, the kind of quiet that felt like it was pressing down on you. I took a deep breath, inhaling the warm scent of sand and stone. This was my escape. No buzzing phone, no frantic emails, just the open sky and the endless horizon. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV in the shade of the rock formation and pulling out my gear. I wanted to explore before the light faded. There was something about the desert that always fascinated me, the way the landscape shifted from harsh to beautiful in a matter of hours. But right now I was focused on one thing: silence. After weeks of being glued to my phone and running from meeting to meeting, the thought of being completely disconnected was a relief. No cell reception out here, no GPS signal, just me and the land. As I unpacked, I heard it, a faint sound, almost too soft to notice. A rhythmic beeping. At first, I thought it was something inside the RV, maybe an alarm or a piece of equipment malfunctioning. But after a quick check of my gear, everything seemed fine. The sound persisted, though, steady and faint, like a pulse just beneath the surface. I stepped outside, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the desert was quiet. The only sound was the faint wind rustling through the rocks. I brushed it off, assuming it was some distant echo of the RV's systems, and finished setting up camp. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, I felt that familiar sense of calm wash over me. This was why I came here, to escape, to let my mind breathe. But that night, the beeping came back. I was sitting by the campfire, watching the flames flicker against the darkening sky, when the sound returned, clearer this time. It was still faint, but persistent. A soft, rhythmic pulse, like something distant calling out. I stood, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily. Logic and reason were my tools, and they had served me well in the world of engineering. But there was something about the sound, something that felt wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from the fire into the darkness. The desert stretched out before me, vast and empty. I started walking, following the faint sound. The rhythmic pulse grew louder as I moved away from the RV. For a while I saw nothing but sand and rock. The beeping seemed to fade, then grow louder again, like it was moving with me, always just out of reach. I kept walking, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night. But every time I thought I was getting closer, the sound slipped away. Finally I stopped. My pulse was racing now, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The beeping had faded again, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the desert. The silence around me was heavy, almost suffocating. I turned back toward the RV. The fire still glowed faintly in the distance as I walked. The beeping returned, faint but steady, like a distant heartbeat. The next morning, the sound was gone. The desert was still quiet, as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Isolation could do that. The vast emptiness of the desert, the absence of any familiar sounds, it could mess with your head. I decided to hike further out, hoping to clear my mind. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, the sun already beating down on the sand. I grabbed my gear, making sure I had plenty of water, and started walking toward a rocky ridge I had spotted in the distance. Halfway there, I saw him. A man walking toward me from the opposite direction, his figure small against the endless desert. I hadn't expected to see anyone out here. This was a remote area, far off the beaten path. As the figure grew closer, I could make out an older man, his clothes worn and dusty, his face lined and weathered from the sun. "Hey!" I called out, raising a hand as we approached each other. The man nodded, his eyes distant, almost vacant. "You camping out here alone?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, just me," I said, a little taken aback by his bluntness. "I've been walking for days," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You heard it yet? The signal?" I blinked, unsure if I had heard him right. "The signal?" He nodded, his expression grim. "You'll hear it. Once you hear it, you can't get it out of your head. I've been following it for days. It doesn't stop." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" The man glanced around nervously, as if the desert itself was listening. "There's something out here. Something that's been broadcasting for years. It gets inside your head, starts with the beeping, then it gets louder. You'll see." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. He looked dehydrated, sunburned, like he'd been wandering the desert for days without rest. I offered him some water, but he shook his head and started walking again, heading back the way he came without another word. I stood there, watching him disappear into the distance, his words echoing in my mind. "Once you hear it, it doesn't stop." That night, the beeping was louder. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound pulsed through the silence, steady and rhythmic, like it was coming from somewhere deep beneath the earth. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the sound was there, burrowing into my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, GPS, water, and set out into the desert. I had to find the source. I had to know what was causing the sound. The desert was pitch black, the sky filled with stars. My flashlight cut through the darkness, the beam dancing across the rocks and sand as I followed the beeping. It was louder now, almost frantic, like it was pulling me towards something. The GPS was acting strange, flickering in and out, as if the signal was being disrupted. But I kept moving, my footsteps crunching in the sand. The beeping grew louder with every step. After what felt like hours, I saw it. A structure, half buried in the sand. A bunker or a weather station, long abandoned. The beeping was deafening now, emanating from somewhere inside. I hesitated, standing at the entrance of the bunker. The door was ajar, rusted and creaking in the wind. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to leave and forget about the sound. But I couldn't. The signal was pulling me in. I stepped inside. The air in the bunker was stale, suffocating. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the narrow corridor, the walls lined with rusted equipment and old faded maps. The beeping was louder now, echoing through the metal walls, vibrating in my chest. At the end of the corridor, I found a small room. In the center, there was an old radio tower, its equipment still faintly powered by some unknown source. But that wasn't what caught my attention. On the walls were symbols, strange, intricate markings that looked like they had been carved into the metal. They spiraled outward, converging on the radio tower as if they were feeding into it. In the corner of the room, I found a journal. Its pages were yellowed and brittle. The entries were short, scrawled in frantic handwriting. They talked about the signal, how it started with the beeping, how it got louder, how it never stopped. "It gets inside your head," one entry read. "It's not just a sound, it's alive." As I read, the beeping shifted, turning into a high-pitched screech that pierced through my skull. I dropped the journal, clutching my head as the sound rattled through my brain. It wasn't just a signal. It was something more, something that had been waiting, broadcasting, pulling people in. I had to get out. I stumbled out of the bunker, the sound still ringing in my ears. The desert spun around me. I ran, my legs weak, my mind spinning. The landscape warped, the rocks and sand shifting as if the desert itself was alive, moving with the signal. When I finally made it back to the RV, I collapsed inside, my head pounding. The beeping was now a constant, dull hum in the back of my mind. I left the desert the next morning, driving as fast as I could. The beeping was still faint but persistent. I didn't look back. Even now, days later, back in the city, I can still hear it. A faint, rhythmic pulse in the back of my mind. Always there, always calling me back. The signal isn't done with me yet.
"6 months in the Smokies. 6 months. 6 whole months without touching a drop. I should have been proud, right? But sitting alone in this RV, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains, I didn't feel proud. I felt restless, empty, even the kind of empty that creeps up on you, settling in your bones when there's nothing but the sound of your own thoughts bouncing around your skull. This trip was supposed to be a celebration, a gift to myself for staying clean. I thought the solitude would help me clear my head, maybe give me some perspective. The Smokies had always been a place of peace for me. My dad used to take me camping here when I was a kid, back when life was simple, before the bottle got its hooks into me. I pulled out my phone, flicking through pictures of those old trips. My thumb hesitated over the last photo of my dad and me standing by a roaring campfire. That was before everything went to hell, before the drinking became my escape from everything I couldn't face. The phone buzzed, pulling me back to the present. It was my brother Jake, checking in as usual. "Hey man," he said when I answered. "How's the trip? You hanging in there?" Jake was always the responsible one, clean-cut, married with kids, a steady job. He'd been my lifeline after the wreckage of my addiction. I owed him more than I could ever repay. "Yeah, it's good," I lied. "Just me and the trees, peaceful." "You staying out of trouble?" I chuckled. "I'm not exactly near any temptations out here," I said. I didn't tell him about the bottle I'd brought with me. It sat in the back of the RV, unopened, but still there, just in case. A cruel comfort. I'd stared at it more than once already, the amber liquid calling to me in the quiet. "Good to hear," Jake said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Just keep your head straight, all right? I know it's tough being out there alone, but you got this. Call me if you need anything." "I will. Thanks." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the trees. The sky faded from a soft orange to deep purple, and with it, the familiar sense of isolation began to settle in. The first night in the Smokies should have been serene, but as soon as the darkness took over, I felt it, the unease. The forest around me was too quiet. It was like it was holding its breath. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the faint crackle of my campfire outside. I sat at the picnic table near the fire, trying to relax, but the silence only seemed to grow heavier. I poked at the flames with a stick, hoping they'd somehow keep the stillness at bay. Then I heard it. A whistle. Faint at first, like a breeze cutting through the trees, but unmistakably human. I froze, listening. It was tuneless, just a single drawn-out note that seemed to float through the air. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. No movement. No one else was supposed to be this far out. I'd parked in a secluded area of the park, away from the main trails. The whistling continued, soft but constant. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded deliberate. I stood, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, and slowly circled the fire. I kept the flames between me and the trees, my eyes darting between the dark shapes of the pines. The whistle came again, louder this time, closer. My heart hammered in my chest, the familiar anxiety clawing its way up my throat. "Who's there?" I called, my voice breaking the thick silence. No response, just another long, drawn-out whistle. I grabbed my flashlight from the RV and swept the beam through the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were shadows. No footsteps, no crunch of leaves, just that damn whistling drifting through the trees like a ghost. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing, right? Just a trick of the wind. The mountains could be strange like that, especially at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The bottle of whiskey in the back of the RV started to look more and more appealing, but I shoved that thought down. I wasn't here for that. Not this time. To clear my head, I went for a hike, following a trail that wound through the dense forest. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. For a while it worked. I could almost forget about the night before. Almost. That's when I saw the first marking. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a rough, jagged symbol that looked like a spiral or maybe an eye. I couldn't tell. It didn't look natural, though. It felt intentional, like a warning. I ran my fingers over it, the grooves deep and uneven. I kept walking, but the further I went, the more of the symbols I saw. Spirals, faces, strange runes carved into trees, all leading deeper into the woods. It felt like they were guiding me somewhere, though I wasn't sure I wanted to find out where. That night, the whistling returned. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to keep my mind off the bottle, when the sound came drifting through the trees. This time, it wasn't soft. It was louder, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the forest. My heart pounded in my ears. My mouth went dry. The whistling seemed to circle the campsite, moving slowly but deliberately. It was all I could hear, filling the silence like a haunting lullaby. I turned, and that's when I saw him. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure. A man, gaunt and pale, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood motionless, his lips pursed as he whistled that same eerie, tuneless note. "Hey!" I called, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. The whistling grew louder, more insistent, cutting through the night air like a knife. I took a step toward him, but as soon as I moved, he turned and disappeared into the trees. My hands were shaking. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, something deeper. I felt the urge to chase him, to follow that haunting sound, but my legs refused to move. I stayed by the fire until dawn, too scared to go back inside the RV. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed up my gear, grabbed the keys to the RV, and decided I'd had enough of the Smokies. But when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over. Just a dull click. I swore under my breath, popped the hood, and checked the battery. Everything looked fine, but the damn thing wouldn't start. I tried calling Jake, but my phone was dead. I'd charged it the night before, but now it was completely drained. No signal, no service, nothing. The forest around me felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting just beyond the trees. The whistling started again, faint at first, then growing louder, like a taunting melody. I grabbed the bottle from the back of the RV. I wasn't going to drink it, not yet. But holding it made me feel better, more in control, as if I could use it as a weapon somehow. That night, the stranger came back. I woke up to the sound of whistling, loud, sharp, right outside the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked out the window. He was standing by the fire pit, his pale face illuminated by the flames. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and that awful whistling filled the air, pressing in on me from all sides. He took a step toward the RV, and I felt the panic rise in my chest. I grabbed the bottle, holding it like a club, and stumbled outside. The air was freezing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whistling pierced through my skull, making it hard to think. I raised the bottle, ready to throw it. But then something stopped me. For the first time in days, I heard something else. A voice, faint but real. Jake's voice. "Nick, don't do it." I blinked, shaking my head. The stranger was gone. The whistling had stopped, and there in the silence, I realized what I had been about to do. The bottle slipped from my hands and shattered on the ground. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The whistling was gone, but the fear, the isolation, it wasn't something I could run from. Not out here. Not anywhere. When the sun rose, I tried the RV again. This time, it started. I drove out of the Smokies that morning, not looking back. The whistling stayed behind, lost in the trees, but the memory of it, the temptation would stay with me. 6 months sober. But this trip taught me something I hadn't been ready to face. Some demons don't live in bottles. They live in the silence, in the spaces we create for ourselves when we're trying to hide from the world. I hadn't planned on staying at Stillwater Grove. The campground wasn't even marked on my map, just a small patch of green near the edge of Shawnee National Forest. But as I drove down the empty forest road, I saw the sign. Old, weathered wood with the words Stillwater Grove Campground carved into it. It felt like an invitation, one I couldn't resist. I'd been on the road for weeks, photographing wildlife for a personal project I'd picked up after quitting my job. The last few months had been a blur of long drives, lonely campsites, and an overwhelming need to be anywhere but back in the city. I didn't miss my corporate job or my ex. What I did miss was the feeling that I knew what the hell I was doing with my life. Stillwater Grove seemed perfect, quiet, isolated, and right by the lake. It would give me the break I needed, some peace before heading back into the real world. When I pulled into the campsite, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grove. The air was still, the only sound being the gentle lapping of water against the shore. A single RV sat on the far side of the campground, a distant figure moving near it. Otherwise, it was just me. I parked my RV near the edge of the lake, the water glistening under the fading light. After setting up camp, I grabbed my camera and headed toward the shore, hoping to catch the sunset. As I stood there, framing the perfect shot, a voice startled me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, her face half in shadow. She had an otherworldly kind of beauty, pale skin, long dark hair, and eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Yeah," I replied, lowering my camera. "It's peaceful," she smiled. "It always is here. I'm Ellie, by the way." "Nick," I said, shaking her outstretched hand. Her skin was cold, like she'd been standing in the shade for too long. "You camping here too?" "For a little while," she said, her voice soft. "I come here every now and then. Can't stay away." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I wasn't used to talking to people much anymore. The solitude had become my comfort zone, and something about Ellie felt out of place. "You here for the fishing?" I asked, trying to make small talk. She shook her head. "No, just the lake. The quiet." We stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, the water reflecting the colors like a mirror. I raised my camera, snapping a few shots, and when I looked back, Ellie was gone, just like that. I glanced around, but there was no sign of her. The other RV was still parked at the far end of the grove, but there was no movement. I chalked it up to her being quick on her feet, though it left me feeling oddly unsettled. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, making the trees outside rustle against each other like whispered secrets. I rolled over in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but something felt off. The RV was too cold, colder than it should have been. I checked the thermostat, but everything seemed normal. Still, the chill lingered. I grabbed a blanket and tried to force myself to sleep. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first, like a woman's voice carried on the wind. I sat up, listening, but it was gone. Just my imagination, I thought. Long days alone in the woods will do that to you. But then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a soft, melodic humming coming from outside. I climbed out of bed, grabbing my flashlight. My breath fogged up in the cold air as I stepped outside the RV, scanning the campsite. Nothing, just the stillness of the lake and the trees swaying gently in the wind. But the humming persisted, coming from near the water's edge. I walked toward the shore, the beam of my flashlight dancing over the ground, and that's when I saw her. A woman in white, standing at the edge of the lake, her back to me. Her long, dark hair hung loose down her back, swaying slightly as she hummed that haunting tune. "Ellie?" I called out, my voice shaking. She didn't turn. She just stood there, motionless, her gaze fixed on the water. Something about the way she stood, so still, so rigid, set my nerves on edge. I took a step closer, the flashlight illuminating her pale figure, but as soon as the light touched her, she vanished. I blinked, stunned. 1 second, she'd been there. And the next, she was gone. The water rippled where she had been standing, but otherwise, the lake was empty. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was that? I hurried back to the RV, locking the door behind me. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps. My hands were shaking. I didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense, but what I'd seen, it wasn't right. I had seen her. I knew I had. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to rationalize what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that woman standing by the lake. The next morning, I found Ellie near the grove, sitting by a small campfire. She smiled when she saw me, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rough night?" she asked, as if she already knew. "Yeah," I said, sitting down across from her. "I saw something last night. A woman by the lake. I thought it was you, but she wasn't there when you got close." Ellie finished, her voice calm, too calm. "The Lady of Stillwater." "The what?" I asked, feeling a chill run through me. Ellie looked at me, her eyes dark and hollow. "She's been here for a long time. Longer than the campground, longer than the trees. She drowned in the lake, or so the story goes. Some say she was waiting for someone. Her lover, I think, but he never showed." I stared at her, my stomach twisting. "You're telling me she's a ghost?" Ellie shrugged. "Call it what you want, but she's real, and now that you've seen her, she won't let you go." I laughed, though it came out shaky. "That's insane." "Is it?" Ellie asked, her gaze locking onto mine. "You saw her. You know she's real." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat. I had seen her, and it hadn't been a trick of the light or my imagination. Something had been there, something that shouldn't have been. "What does she want?" I asked quietly. Ellie's eyes flicked toward the lake. She wants what she's always wanted, to take someone with her into the water. That night, the sound started again. At first, it was the soft humming, drifting through the night air. Then the splashing, gentle, rhythmic, like someone wading through the water. I lay in bed, my heart racing, my body tense. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to see her again. But the pull was stronger this time. A strange compulsion tugged at me, drawing me toward the lake. I tried to fight it, to stay in the RV, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me outside into the cold night air. The lake was calm, reflecting the pale moonlight. And there she was, standing in the water, her white dress billowing around her as if moved by an unseen current. "Come to me," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. "Please come." I took a step forward, my body moving against my will. The water lapped at my shoes, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. "Come with me," she said again, her voice almost pleading now. "I've waited so long." I fought to resist, to break free from whatever force was drawing me in. But my feet kept moving, the water now up to my knees, freezing cold. I could feel the pull of the lake, the weight of the water dragging me down. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me back with such force that I stumbled onto the shore. Ellie stood beside me, her face pale, her grip strong. "You have to leave," she said, her voice urgent now. "Before it's too late." I looked back at the lake, but the woman was gone. The water was still, as if nothing had happened. "What the hell is happening?" I gasped, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Ellie's expression was grim. "She's marked you now. If you stay, she'll take you. You have to go." I didn't argue. I packed up my things, my hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Within minutes, I was back in the RV, starting the engine and pulling out of the campsite as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Ellie stood at the edge of the grove, watching me go, her face unreadable. And behind her, just barely visible in the mist, was the Lady of Stillwater, her pale eyes following me, waiting for me to return. I didn't look back again. My name's Brian Patel, and this happened to me in the National Forest in Oregon. I grew up in Portland and spent most weekends hiking the trails with my dad. After he passed away, I kept the tradition alive, even though the solitude wasn't quite the same. I wasn't the sentimental type, but being out there brought some quiet to my otherwise loud, chaotic life as an electrician. That particular weekend, and I'd planned a 2-day solo trek, something to clear my head and test out some new gear. I wasn't an ultralight fanatic or anything, but I liked keeping things minimal. Just me, the trail, and whatever nature threw at me. My route started at Timberline Lodge and cut through some backcountry trails that didn't see much traffic. It was early morning when I set out, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a map in the other. The first few hours were uneventful. The trails were damp from rain earlier in the week, and the scent of pine mixed with the occasional waft of mushrooms kept things pleasant. Around noon, I passed an older couple hiking with trekking poles. They waved but didn't stop to chat, which was fine by me. Solitude was the point. It was late afternoon when I noticed the first odd thing. I'd stopped at a clearing to refill my water from a nearby creek. The silence was too perfect. No birds, no rustling, nothing. It wasn't unusual for animals to scatter when a human came stomping through, but this was eerie, like the forest was holding its breath. I joked to myself that maybe I'd finally reached that perfect peace people were always yapping about in self-help books. As I climbed higher into the denser part of the forest, the feeling lingered. Every so often, I'd hear a snapping twig or see a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, but I chalked it up to squirrels or deer. That changed when I reached the ridge. There was a campsite up there, or at least what was left of one. A collapsed tent lay flattened against the dirt, its poles bent at odd angles. Gear was scattered around like someone had emptied a backpack in a panic. What caught my attention was the cooler, one of those sturdy, bear-resistant kinds. Its lid was wrenched open, and deep claw marks gouged the plastic. I didn't recognize the pattern. It didn't look like bear claws. Whatever did it had talons. I poked around cautiously. A jacket with a name tag, Franklin, hung on a low branch, ripped down the middle like someone had tried to peel it off. That's when I saw the blood. Not a lot, but enough to know something had gone wrong. My stomach tightened. I didn't consider myself squeamish, but the combination of the silence and the blood made the air feel heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I didn't linger. I wasn't about to play hero and investigate further, but I also didn't want to turn back the way I'd come. The campsite had a bad vibe, and if someone was injured, I wasn't eager to meet whatever or whoever had caused it. I decided to push forward toward a secondary trailhead about 5 miles out. It wasn't on my original route, but it would get me out of there quicker. The trail narrowed as I descended into a gully. Thick undergrowth swallowed most of the light, and the temperature seemed to drop. My boots squelched in the damp earth as I pushed past ferns that slapped against my legs. About halfway down, I caught a foul odor, like rotting meat mixed with damp fur. My first thought was a dead animal, maybe a cougar kill left to rot, but it was strong enough to make my eyes water. Then I heard it, a low, deep rumbling noise that didn't sound natural. It wasn't a growl, but it wasn't mechanical either. It reverberated through the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint the direction. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I chose the third option, freeze. I crouched low, scanning the trees, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of heavy footsteps. I forced myself to move, creeping forward as quietly as possible. The trail curved ahead, and just as I rounded the bend, I saw it, or at least part of it. A massive, hulking shape loomed through the trees, crouched over something on the ground. Its limbs were grotesquely long, the joints bending in ways that didn't make sense. It had patches of wiry fur mottled with bare, pale skin. What struck me most was its posture, like a predator that had evolved to ambush. I stayed hidden behind a tree, trying not to breathe. Whatever it was feeding, its movements jerky and almost insect-like. The thing was tearing into something unrecognizable, its talons slicing through flesh with surgical precision. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to retch. The smell was overwhelming. A sudden snap of a branch underfoot betrayed me. The creature's head shot up, swiveling unnaturally as it scanned for the source of the noise. I didn't get a clear view of its face, but I did see its teeth, rows of uneven serrated spikes that looked like they belonged in a shark, not on land. I bolted. Stealth be damned, I sprinted down the trail, branches clawing at my face and arms. The sound of pursuit was immediate, heavy footfalls crashing through the undergrowth. I didn't dare look back. My pack jostled against my shoulders as I weaved through the narrow trail, adrenaline pushing me faster than I thought possible. The trail forked ahead, and I veered left without thinking. Bad move. The path led to a dead end, a sheer drop-off into a ravine. My options were limited. Jump and risk breaking something, or turn and face the thing head-on. Neither seemed appealing. I scrambled up a boulder, hoping to gain some height and buy myself time. The creature burst through the trees moments later, its gangly frame silhouetted against the dim light. Up close, it was worse. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, and its movements were unnervingly smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. It paused, tilting its head as if deciding whether I was worth the effort. I fumbled for the small knife in my pocket, knowing it was more symbolic than anything. The creature lunged forward, and I did the only thing I could. I threw my pack at it. The motion startled it, and it recoiled briefly, giving me enough time to leap down the side of the ravine. I tumbled hard, dirt and rocks tearing at my clothes as I slid to the bottom. My ankle twisted painfully, but I managed to scramble to my feet. The creature didn't follow immediately, but I could hear it pacing above, its claws scraping against the rocks as it searched for another way down. I limped through the ravine, following the trickle of water downstream. My only thought was to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. The ravine eventually opened up into a clearing, and I spotted a ranger's cabin in the distance. Relief surged through me, though it was tempered by the realization that I wasn't out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively. The cabin was locked, but I found an axe leaning against the woodpile. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I crouched low, gripping the axe and scanning the tree line. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, every rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. When it came, it was sudden. The creature barreled into the clearing, moving faster than seemed possible for its lanky frame. I swung the axe as it charged, catching it in the shoulder. The impact staggered it, but the thing didn't go down. It lashed out with its talons, grazing my arm and drawing blood. We circled each other, predator and prey, roles blurring. I swung again, aiming for its head this time. The blade connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature let out a piercing screech. It collapsed, twitching violently before going still. I didn't stick around to admire my handiwork. With my arm bleeding and my ankle screaming in pain, I limped back toward the trailhead, keeping an eye on the shadows. I flagged down the first car I saw, a bewildered couple who probably thought I'd lost my mind. Years later, I avoid Mount Hood. Not because I'm scared, but because I've learned to stick to places where nature follows the rules, or at least pretends to. I'm going to be honest with you. Being a cop in a small town isn't glamorous. It's not like the movies where every day is a shootout or a high-speed chase. It's mostly handling neighbor disputes over where someone's fence ends or someone's dog barking too much. My name's Lucas Giroux, and I've been wearing the badge for 9 years here in Chesterville, Louisiana. Population about 2,000, give or take. I love this town. It's quiet, peaceful for the most part, and I like that. My days are usually filled with mundane tasks, which suits me just fine. I didn't sign up to be some action hero, but that was before what happened in 2014. That night, everything changed. Chesterville sits on the edge of Lake Vere, a slow-moving body of water surrounded by cypress trees and swampland. People here fish, drink, and go about their lives. It was a pretty uneventful Thursday evening. I was sitting in the patrol car near the lake, enjoying the last of my coffee. That's when the call came through. Domestic disturbance, 14 miles out of town, near the edge of the bayou. Some old shack out there. Probably a drunk couple having a fight. I sighed, thinking about how cold my coffee was going to get by the time I got back. I could have ignored the call. In a town this small, people mostly resolve their issues on their own. But it's my job, and I'm not the kind of guy to leave a job half done. So I punched the gas and headed toward the edge of the swamp, the smell of rotting vegetation creeping into the car through the vents. The air always smells different out there. Heavy, like something's growing in the darkness. The address was off the main road, way off. I had to take a gravel path that was barely wide enough for my cruiser, with branches scraping against the sides like they were trying to keep me from going any further. The place was almost hidden behind thick trees, vines practically choking the building itself. It was an old, decaying wooden structure, more of a cabin than a house. When I stepped out of the car, everything felt wrong. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, but I shook it off. Maybe I was just on edge because it was so quiet. And in a town where quiet usually means safety, this felt different, like something was waiting. I knocked on the door, no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. That's when I heard it, a scraping noise from inside, something heavy being dragged across the floor. I called out, "Chesterville PD, anyone home?" Still nothing. Now, I've dealt with drunks, domestic fights, and all sorts of noise complaints, but the sound coming from inside wasn't something I'd heard before. My hand instinctively went to my gun as I tried the doorknob. Locked. I circled the cabin, looking for another way in, when I noticed something strange, a set of footprints leading around the back. But not human ones. These prints were larger, clawed, like some kind of animal. But whatever made them was walking on two legs, and they were fresh. I was starting to think this wasn't just some domestic dispute. I followed the prints, feeling a chill in the pit of my stomach. As I reached the back of the cabin, I saw the door was ajar, hanging on its hinges. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, like rotting meat mixed with damp earth. The cabin was small, just one room, with a dirty mattress on the floor and a table covered in old newspapers. But what caught my eye was the blood. It was smeared across the floor, thick and dark, leading to a corner where something was slumped. I shone the flashlight on it. It was a man, or what was left of him. His body had been torn apart, like he'd been mauled by something much bigger than any animal I'd ever seen in these parts. His chest was ripped open, ribs exposed, and his face, well, there wasn't much left to recognize. I barely had time to process the scene when I heard that same dragging noise again, but closer this time, coming from behind me. I turned, heart racing, and shone the light toward the sound. Something was moving in the shadows, something big. At first I thought it was a bear, but bears don't move like that, and they sure as hell don't stand on two legs. It stepped into the light and I froze. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, with matted fur and a face that looked almost human, but twisted, distorted, like something halfway between a person and a wolf. Its claws were long, too long for anything natural, and its mouth was smeared with blood, teeth glistening like knives. I didn't hesitate. I drew my gun and fired, emptying the magazine into the thing's chest. But it barely flinched. The bullets hit, sure, but they didn't seem to do much more than piss it off. It let out this low sound, like it was irritated more than hurt, and took a step toward me. I backed up, reloading as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I've never been a great shot, but at this range, it didn't seem to matter. Nothing was going to stop this thing. It lunged. I dove out of the way, crashing into a shelf that sent bottles and cans scattering across the floor. My head was spinning, but I managed to scramble to my feet and run for the door. I don't know how, but I made it back to the car, slamming the door shut just as it slammed into the side of the cruiser, rocking it on its wheels. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the mud as I gunned it back down the gravel path. The thing didn't follow me. It just stood there in the rearview mirror, watching. As I sped away, its shape slowly faded into the darkness of the swamp. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I had to call it in. But what the hell was I gonna say? That some kind of monster tore a man apart and nearly killed me? I thought about it for a long moment, staring at the radio, before deciding to do something I never thought I'd do. I lied. When I called it in, I said I found the man already dead. Looked like some kind of animal attack. Maybe a bear, maybe a wild dog. Hell, maybe both. I didn't mention the thing I saw. I couldn't. No one would believe me. I barely believed it myself. But here's the thing. I wasn't the only one out there that night. I found out later that 2 fishermen had been on the lake, close enough to the cabin to hear the gunshots. They saw something too, something large, moving through the trees. They didn't get a good look at it, but they said it wasn't a bear, wasn't anything they'd ever seen before, and they swore it walked on 2 legs. The next morning, I went back out there with the sheriff and a couple of deputies. We found the body, or what was left of it, but there was no sign of the creature, just those same strange tracks leading off into the swamp. The sheriff wrote it up as an animal attack, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew something didn't add up. I've thought about that night a lot since then, about how close I came to ending up like that poor bastard in the cabin, and about what's still out there, lurking in the swamp. Some nights, when it's real quiet, I wonder if it's still watching. But I've learned not to go looking for answers. Sometimes, in a place like this, it's better to let the mysteries stay buried.
Here's your corrected and polished version of the paragraph. My name is Stephen Miller. I'm 33 years old, and this happened last September in Blackwater Falls State Park, West Virginia. I had just landed my first solo freelance assignment, a travel feature for an outdoor magazine. It was my chance to prove to myself, and maybe to a few others, that I could thrive on my own after leaving a toxic relationship. I didn't expect the park's breathtaking beauty to be marred by whispers of the past, or that those whispers would grow louder with each passing night. When I first arrived, the park was everything I'd hoped for. My RV fit snugly into a secluded campsite overlooking the gorge, the roar of the falls constant in the distance. Blackwater Falls was a photographer's dream. Cascading water, mist rising through the gorge, and vibrant autumn foliage painted in fiery reds and oranges. The first day was perfect. I hiked, shot hundreds of photos, and scribbled notes about the trails and wildlife. The peace and quiet were a balm, exactly what I needed after months of turmoil. That evening, I sat by the fire, sipping tea and scrolling through my shots. That's when I saw it for the first time. At the edge of one frame, a figure stood between 2 trees. It was a man, his clothes ragged and his face shadowed. I frowned, zooming in, but the details remained blurred. I didn't remember seeing anyone during my hike, and the figure hadn't appeared in any other photos. I shook it off as an optical illusion, probably a trick of light and shadows, and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The second day brought strange encounters. I started the morning by stopping at the visitor center, hoping to get some local insight. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, was friendly, but seemed to be watching me too closely. She eyed my camera gear and smiled knowingly. "Planning to photograph the falls?" she asked. "That's the idea," I replied. Maggie hesitated, her smile faltering. "Be careful around the falls, especially near dusk. The dead don't like company." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Before I could ask more, she turned to help another guest, leaving me with a vague unease. Later, on a trail to the falls, I ran into Gary, a park ranger. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a genial demeanor. As he gave me a quick overview of the park's history, I brought up Maggie's warning. He chuckled. "Oh, that's just local folklore. Back in the Civil War, there was a Confederate soldier who hid out in the gorge. They say he deserted his regiment and was hunted down near the falls. Some folks claim his spirit never left, but I've worked here for years and never seen a thing. Let me know if you'd like any further refinements."
Legs. Let me know if you need anything else. Requested. It stepped into the light and I froze. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, with matted fur and a face that looked almost human, but twisted, distorted, like something halfway between a person.
Here's your corrected and polished version of the paragraph. I tried to laugh with him, but his words stayed with me. That evening, the first real sign of something unnatural occurred. I set up my tripod near the falls, hoping to capture the golden hour light. As I framed the shot, my breath caught. The air around me had turned frigid, my breath fogging in front of me despite the mild weather. My camera refused to focus. the lens shuddering as if something was blocking it. And then, faint but unmistakable, I heard whispers. I spun around, expecting to see other hikers, but I was alone. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and indecipherable, like a crowd speaking just out of earshot. The unease became unbearable, and I packed up in a rush, leaving the falls as the last light of day faded. That night, back at the RV, I reviewed the day's photos. Most were stunning, the falls bathed in warm golden light. But in 3 of them, the figure from the previous day appeared again. This time he was closer, standing at the edge of the water. His face was clearer now, pale, gaunt, with dark hollows where his eyes should have been. And in the last photo, he was staring directly at the camera. I slammed my laptop shut and locked the RV door. The next morning I debated cutting the trip short, but a part of me couldn't let it go. I'd always prided myself on being rational, and I wasn't going to let a few strange occurrences ruin my assignment. While hiking near the falls, I noticed an overgrown side trail. Curiosity tugged at me, and I followed it, ducking beneath low-hanging branches. It led to a clearing where the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. In the center of the clearing was a patch of disturbed earth, as though something had been buried there long ago. Nearby I found an object half buried in the dirt, a weathered leather journal. The pages were brittle but legible, written in a looping, old-fashioned script. The entries told the story of a Confederate soldier who had deserted his regiment and fled into the gorge. His words were filled with fear and desperation. The nights grow colder, and I hear them coming. I cannot outrun my fate. The last entry read, "They will find me tonight. I will not see another sunrise." I closed the journal. Here is your corrected paragraph. The soldier stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. He didn't move, didn't blink, but his hollow eyes locked onto mine. My chest tightened with fear as I realized he wasn't alone. Shadows emerged from the trees, darker and more twisted, their forms writhing like smoke. They whispered accusations, voices overlapping in a cacophony. "Traitor! Coward! You will not leave." Panicking, I grabbed the journal and held it up. "Is this what you want?" I shouted. The soldier's expression shifted. Sadness, perhaps gratitude, and he gestured toward the disturbed earth I'd seen earlier. I understood. Clutching the journal, I ran back to the clearing. The shadows followed, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. My hands shook as I placed the journal on the grave and whispered a quiet prayer for peace. The air around me grew still. The shadows stopped, their forms dissolving into the night. The soldier lingered for a moment longer, his hollow eyes softening before fading into the mist. By morning, the oppressive feeling had lifted. The forest seemed brighter, the air lighter, and for the first time in days, I felt safe. Before leaving, I stopped at the visitor center to return the journal. Maggie was there, her knowing smile greeting me. "You helped him, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, unsure how to respond. She reached out, patting my hand. "He's free now. You did a good thing." As I drove away from Blackwater Falls, I realized the experience had changed me. I didn't have all the answers, but I no longer felt the weight of doubt and fear that had followed me into the park. Sometimes the past lingers in ways we can't explain, and sometimes all it takes to move forward is to lay it to rest. Your spelling and grammar were mostly perfect. I just added some formatting for readability. Let me know if you'd like any further refinements. Blurred. I didn't remember seeing anyone during my hike, and the figure hadn't appeared in any other photos. I shook it off as an optical illusion, probably a trick of light and shadows, and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The second day brought strange encounters. I started the morning by stopping at the visitor center, hoping to get some local insight. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, was friendly but seemed to be watching me too closely. She eyed my camera gear and smiled knowingly. "Planning to photograph the falls?" she asked. "That's the idea," I replied. Maggie hesitated, her smile faltering. "Be careful around the falls, especially near dusk. The dead don't like company." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Before I could ask more, she turned to help another guest, leaving me with a vague unease. Later, on a trail to the falls, I ran into Gary, a park ranger. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a genial demeanor. As he gave me a quick overview of the park's history, I brought up...
I wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. Not in this forest. Not sitting in this RV, staring at the tall trees outside, wondering if this trip would be my last. G. Ford Pinot National Forest had been Karen's idea, years ago. She had this way of looking at the world, seeing the beauty in everything. She wanted to camp here, hike the trails, soak in the stillness of the ancient trees. I didn't get it then. Too caught up in work, too busy to care. But now, it was all I had left. It had been a year since she died, and I still couldn't make sense of it. A car accident on a quiet street. Just like that, she was gone, and I was left stumbling through life, trying to figure out how to exist without her. This trip was my last attempt at finding something, anything, that made sense. So here I was, parked deep in the middle of nowhere, hoping that the forest would somehow offer answers. I didn't know what else to do. The trees stretched up into the sky, their thick trunks casting shadows that lingered even in the daylight. It was beautiful in a way, but it felt empty without her. I could almost hear her voice telling me to look at the wildflowers or marvel at the way the sunlight filtered through the branches. I stepped out of the RV. The cool, damp air wrapped around me. The scent of pine and moss was thick, earthy. Everything seemed so alive, and yet all I could feel was the weight of the past pressing down on me. I started a small fire, just like I'd done the past few nights, and sat there watching the flames dance. The crackling wood was the only sound in the stillness. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, barely audible over the fire, but distinct enough to make me stand up, heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Just shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe some other animal, but the feeling stuck, the sense that someone was watching me. I wasn't alone. I sat back down, trying to shake the unease, but it lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about the old man I'd met the day before. Edgar. He'd been wandering the campground when I arrived, his wrinkled face covered in a scruffy beard, eyes sharp despite his age. He was friendly enough, but there had been something off about him. "You came at the wrong time," he'd said, staring at me with a knowing look. "Why is that?" I'd asked, brushing it off. Some things shouldn't be disturbed, especially at night. The forest, it has its secrets. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't respond. But his words stuck with me, replaying in my mind as I sat by the fire. What did he mean by secrets? What was he talking about? I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, sitting in the dark with the fire flickering low, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to what he'd said. The wind picked up, making the trees sway, their branches creaking overhead. The fire sputtered as the breeze caught it, and I stood up again, feeling restless. I needed to move, to walk, anything to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the forest, just far enough to feel like I was doing something. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the trees, but casting long shadows everywhere else. My footsteps were the only sound now, crunching softly on the forest floor. I don't know how far I walked before I saw the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a spiral-like shape that looked old, weathered by time. I crouched down, running my fingers over it. It was smooth, unnaturally so, like it had been carved recently. I stood up, shining the light around, and spotted more symbols carved into the trees at odd intervals. Spirals, faces, shapes that made no sense. They all seemed to be pointing deeper into the forest, like a trail leading me somewhere. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back, trying to ignore the nagging curiosity that pulled at me. I wasn't here to chase after strange carvings. I was here to, well, I didn't know why I was here anymore, but this wasn't it. As I made my way back toward the RV, the air seemed heavier, colder. I couldn't hear the wind anymore, and the shadows seemed darker. The feeling that I was being watched returned, stronger this time, like someone or something was following me. My pulse quickened, and I picked up the pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. Nothing, just trees and shadows. When I reached the RV, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The fire had gone out, leaving nothing but smoldering embers. I climbed inside, locked the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed, heart still racing. I was just tired. That's all it was. The grief, the isolation, it was messing with my head. I hadn't been sleeping well, and the loneliness had a way of playing tricks on the mind. At least that's what I told myself. The next morning, I met Leah. She was hiking near the campground, a pack slung over her shoulders, looking every bit the confident outdoorswoman. She was friendly, outgoing, and struck up a conversation with me as soon as we crossed paths. "You camping out here alone?" she asked, her voice light, casual. I nodded. "Yeah, needed some time away, I guess." "I get that," she said, smiling. "This place is something else. It's beautiful, but it can get a little weird at night, don't you think?" I paused, remembering the footsteps, the carvings, Edgar's warnings. "Weird?" I asked. "How strange it can feel out here after dark. Just stories, old legends. You know how it is with places like this. Every forest has its ghost stories." I tried to keep my tone neutral, but the unease from the night before still lingered. She smiled again, but this time, there was something in her eyes, like she knew more than she was letting on. "Just be careful. It's easy to get lost out here," she said. With that, she waved and continued down the trail, disappearing into the trees. I watched her go, wondering if I should have said more, asked her what she meant, but I didn't. I spent the rest of the day at camp, trying to relax, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. That night, as I sat by the fire again, I couldn't stop thinking about the symbols. They'd seemed so deliberate, so purposeful, like someone or something was trying to lead me deeper into the woods. And then the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the trees, but saw nothing, just shadows. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the RV, slow, deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. My throat tightened as I strained to listen, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, but the footsteps didn't answer. Instead, they stopped. Dead silence. I backed toward the RV, fumbling for the door when I saw it. Movement just at the edge of the trees. A figure, tall, thin, barely visible in the darkness. I blinked and it was gone. I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in short gasps. What the hell was happening? I sat there for hours, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, Leah was gone. Her tent was still there, her pack sitting neatly outside, but she was nowhere to be found. I searched the area, calling her name, but the forest was silent. It didn't make sense. People didn't just vanish like that, not without a trace. I thought about Edgar, about the stories he'd told, the forgotten one he'd called it, a legend about a man who'd wandered too far into the forest, losing himself until he became part of the land itself. Now, they said he lured others to join him, preying on their grief, their loneliness, until they disappeared too. I didn't believe it. I couldn't. But Leah was gone, and the symbols were still there, etched into the trees like a warning or an invitation. The footsteps returned that night, and this time, I knew what they wanted. I could hear her voice, Karen's voice, calling to me from the trees, soft, loving, like she was right there, waiting for me. "Derek," she whispered, "come find me." My heart ached, torn between the impossible and the undeniable. I knew it wasn't real. I knew it, but I wanted to believe it was. I stepped outside. The cold air bit at my skin. The forest was dark, silent, but the voice was there, guiding me. I walked toward the trees, my feet moving on their own, drawn by the sound of her voice. "Derek," she called again. "Don't leave me." I stopped at the edge of the woods, staring into the darkness. I could see her now just beyond the first row of trees, her face, her smile. She was there, waiting for me. But something was wrong. The shadows around her shifted, twisting like they were alive. Her eyes, once warm and familiar, were hollow, empty. I took a step back, the spell breaking. This wasn't Karen. I turned and ran back to the RV, back to safety. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in as the voice grew louder, angrier. Derek! I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear her screaming my name from the trees, but I didn't go back. I couldn't. I left Ford Pinot the next morning, the RV's engine sputtering to life as I drove away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The forest had its secrets. I wasn't meant to know them. And whatever it was out there, whatever the forgotten one truly was, it would stay there, waiting for someone else. I thought the desert would heal me. Red Rock Canyon was supposed to be a place to clear my head, to sit in silence and let the vast empty land take away the chaos of the last few months. I'd lost everything, my wife, my job, and I needed something, anything, to remind me there was still some peace left in the world. Instead, it felt like I'd driven into a nightmare. I parked the RV at the far end of the campground, as far away from the few other campers as I could get. I wanted solitude, to think, or maybe to stop thinking. I wasn't sure. The sun was setting as I stepped out, casting a deep orange glow across the red sandstone cliffs. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that made you feel small, like the world was too big for you to matter. Maybe that's what I needed. I'd been driving for hours, with only the occasional crackle of the radio for company. The RV was old, creaking and groaning as I navigated the winding roads into the canyon. It had seen better days, much like me. As I stretched, a low rumble came from under the hood. "Great," I muttered, giving the RV a half-hearted kick. The engine had been acting up for days, but I figured I could deal with it later. I wasn't here for that. I was here to get away, to let the emptiness of the desert swallow me whole. That night, after I'd settled in, I sat outside the RV, staring up at the stars. Out here, away from the city, the sky was incredible, clear, endless. But as the stars twinkled overhead, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought they were planes, blinking in and out far above the canyon. But then they moved too fast, too erratically. I leaned forward, squinting. There were 3 of them, glowing faintly blue, darting through the sky in impossible patterns. They weren't planes. I wasn't sure what they were. I stood up, straining my neck to follow their path as they circled overhead. They blinked off one by one, and the desert was silent again. Just stars, I told myself, even though I knew it wasn't true. The next morning, I woke up to find the RV's battery almost dead. My phone, which I'd left charging overnight, hadn't gained a single bar. I tried turning the engine over, but all I got was a dull click. My chest tightened. Being stranded in the middle of the desert wasn't part of the plan. I had enough food and water for a few days, sure, but the isolation was starting to feel less like a retreat and more like a trap. Milo's RV was parked a few spots down, his beat-up RV sitting in the shade of a large rock formation. He waved me over as I stepped out of mine, a wide grin on his sunburnt face. "Morning," he called. "Beautiful day, huh?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure. Hey, you wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" Milo scratched his scruffy chin, then shook his head. "Sorry, friend, but I can give you a ride into town later if you need help. It's not too far." I thanked him, but something about Milo unsettled me. Maybe it was how relaxed he seemed, like this place wasn't bothering him at all. As I stood there, he tilted his head toward the canyon walls. "You see the lights last night?" he asked. I froze. "Yeah, what were they?" He shrugged, like it was nothing. "Oh, those things. People talk about them all the time. Could be military, could be something else. No one really knows, but they've been around as long as I've been camping out here." I laughed nervously. "Something else, huh?" Milo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "People say they're not from this world. I don't know about that, but sometimes they follow you. Just don't go too far out at night, and you'll be fine." I forced another laugh, but my stomach churned. Milo's tone was too casual, too accepting. I thanked him again, and went back to my RV, trying to shake off the feeling that I was missing something important. The day dragged on, the heat baking the ground beneath my feet. I spent the afternoon hiking a short trail near the campground, trying to clear my head, but the vast emptiness only made me feel more alone. I kept thinking about the lights, about how they'd moved, how they seemed to watch me. That night, they returned. I was sitting outside again, nursing a warm beer and staring at the sky when I saw them, 3 faint blue lights hovering over the canyon. This time, they were closer, too close. They flickered almost playfully, darting back and forth like they were searching for something. I stood up, my heart pounding. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this place made sense. I backed toward the RV, never taking my eyes off the lights, but as I reached for the door, the lights blinked out. Gone, just like that. A cold breeze swept through the canyon, and I shivered. It was too quiet. No wind, no insects, nothing, just the dead, suffocating silence of the desert. Then the RV lights flickered once, twice, and went dark. My chest tightened as I stumbled into the RV, fumbling for the flashlight. I clicked it on, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness. The electrical panel was dead, and my phone wouldn't turn on. Every piece of technology I had was failing, and I had no idea why. A sudden knock on the door made me jump. "Chris, you okay?" It was Emily, the hiker I'd met earlier that day. She'd pitched her tent nearby, planning to stay for a few nights before heading out. I opened the door, trying to hide my panic. "Yeah, just some electrical issues," I said, forcing a smile. "Everything's dead. I'm guessing the battery's shot." Emily frowned, glancing back at her tent. "That's weird. My phone's dead too, and my flashlight keeps flickering." Her voice was calm, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She felt it too, the strangeness in the air, the weight of the silence. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you think it's the lights? Milo told me about them earlier, said people disappear sometimes." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Disappear?" Emily nodded, her gaze drifting toward the canyon. "Yeah, it's mostly stories, but you seemed pretty convinced." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt thick, heavy, like the desert was closing in on us. I wasn't sure if I believed in Milo's campfire tales, but the lights, they were real, and they weren't natural. "We should get out of here," Emily said, breaking the silence. "I don't like this." "I can't," I replied. "My RV won't start." She hesitated, then nodded. "Mine either. I tried earlier, but it's completely dead." We stood there, staring at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. Something was wrong with this place. The lights weren't just an oddity. They were doing something, affecting everything around us, and we were stuck miles from any help. "We'll wait till morning," I said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe it's just a temporary glitch. We'll figure it out." Emily didn't look convinced, but she nodded and headed back to her tent. I locked the RV door behind her, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. That night, I barely slept. The silence was oppressive, like a blanket wrapped too tight around me. Every creak of the RV, every gust of wind made my heart race. I kept waiting for the lights to come back, to hover outside my window, but they didn't. Instead, I woke up sometime in the early hours. Drenched in sweat, my head pounding. I sat up, blinking in the darkness. Something was wrong. I glanced at my watch. It was 4 a.m., but that didn't make sense. I'd checked the time just moments ago, and it had been midnight. Where had the hours gone? I stumbled outside, feeling disoriented. The air was cooler now, the desert's chill settling in. The stars were out, but there was no sign of the lights. My mind was foggy, like I'd been dreaming. But the dust on my boots told me I'd been walking. But where? And why? Panic surged through me. I couldn't remember. Hours were missing, and I had no idea what had happened. The lights were playing with us, toying with our sense of reality. I ran toward Emily's tent, calling her name, but when I got there, she was gone. Her tent was empty, her pack still there, but she was nowhere to be found. "Emily!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. Nothing. The only sound was the wind. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the lights, the missing time, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. We weren't alone. I sprinted back to my RV, slamming the door behind me, and tried the engine again. To my shock, it roared to life. The headlights flickered on, and I didn't hesitate. I jammed the gear shift into drive and tore out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the winding canyon road. I glanced in the rearview mirror for just a second. I saw them, the blue lights hovering in the distance, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I hit the outskirts of Las Vegas. The neon lights of the city felt like a lifeline. But even then, as I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lights were still out there, waiting. And I wasn't sure if I'd really escaped at all.